everybody. This is the video lecture about how cultural anthropologists address human rights. It's part of the Human Rights Unit. So, where I wanted to begin is actually to go back to a couple of concepts that we talked about much earlier in the course in the Cultural Anthropology unit, and that's the distinction between cultural relativism and moral relativism. You may remember that we talked about both of these ideas. Cultural relativism is the idea that it's important to suspend one's own cultural assumptions in favor of trying to understand cultural practices from the perspective of the people within that community themselves. So it's putting aside your own ideas about what is best, what is right, what is wrong, and instead trying to get sort of an insider perspective on why and how people do the things they do, culturally speaking, right? So something like the image in the upper left, which is about sort of a few variations on greeting practices, all of which are, perfectly relevant and understood in cultural context, but they're different from one another. So the idea being that we want to be accepting of the variations in cultural practice and try to understand them in their own setting. Now, when I talked about cultural relativism in that earlier part of the course, I made the point that cultural relativism is not the same as moral relativism. In other words, cultural anthropologists make an argument that it's important to suspend judgment in order to understand a cultural world different than one's own, but that doesn't mean that we give up all sort of ideas about what is right and wrong, right? So in other words, being a cultural relativist does not mean that you also need to be a moral relativist. Moral relativism would be the idea that there is no basic sort of standard for something being acceptable or unacceptable, that it's all relative. And as I said then, cultural anthropologists, for the most part, don't take a stance of moral relativism. So cultural anthropologists absolutely espouse cultural relativism and are very much against and try to work against ethnocentrism, but also understand, and I think for the most part embrace, the idea of universal human rights. So in other words, there's a difference between honoring cultural particularities and still also wanting to honor the idea of universal human rights. That is, that there are some baselines of what people everywhere in the world should be able to expect out of life, including things like freedom from suffering, access to food and healthcare and education, etc. So international initiatives, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are also very much a part of how cultural anthropologists approach their own work as researchers and as part of their worldview. Now let's get a little bit more specific about what that actually means or how that actually is put into practice. One of the things that you read for this part of the unit is a statement on human rights from the American Anthropological Association. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I wanted to start with what I think is a more basic, fundamental sort of document or set of principles also out of the AAA, which is the AAA Code of Ethics. The American Anthropological Association is the biggest professional organization of anthropologists in the United States. So it does a lot of different kinds of things, but one is to put forward policies and principles for anthropologists to follow or to use as guidelines in their work. So the basic AAA Code of Ethics is a set of standards or expectations of how cultural anthropologists act while we are doing our field research. It includes, some things that we would probably expect to see in any professional code of ethics, such as do no harm, right? It also includes being open about our work. What that means for the most part is that anthropologists very much believe that if you're going to go do ethnographic research in a community, it's absolutely crucial that you are straightforward with people about the fact that that's what you're doing. So in other words, it would never be okay for a cultural anthropologist to do sort of an undercover project where you pretend like you're there for some other reason and you're secretly observing people, for example, right? Instead, it's crucial as a matter of ethics to say right out front, I'm here, I'm a cultural anthropologist, I'm here to do research, I'd like to get your permission to talk to you, et cetera, right? And in fact, getting that permission is one of the next aspects of the Code of Ethics. Informed consent, which is again a concept I'm sure you're familiar with. It's used in lots of different settings, and it simply means that people need to know what you are asking of them, and they need to explicitly consent to participating in that. Anthropologists in the field are interacting with lots of different folks. So it might be people in a community, but also the politicians or other kinds of leaders who have a role in that community. Or it might be people in a neighborhood and also the other researchers at the local university. So this can sometimes pose certain kinds of ethical challenges, and weighing those sometimes competing obligations is another part of the code. The ethics of anthropologists also extends to not only what we do while we're in the field collecting the information, but what we do once we're done with that and we're in the process of, say, writing and publishing things. So making our results accessible, meaning people should be able to get a hold of them, read them, right? Making sure our records are carefully protected, right? That any kind of confidential information that someone might tell you is not accessible to people who shouldn't have access to it. And more broadly, maintaining respectful and ethical professional relationships, not only in the field but with our colleagues back in our home countries where we do our work as educators, researchers, professors, etc. Now, the thing that I had you read is the AAA Statement on Anthropology and Human Rights. And in a lot of ways, I think it sort of builds on that fundamental basic code of ethics. The code of ethics is about what we are doing as individual researchers in the field, but all of that also has implications for our understandings of what human rights are and of what our obligations may be as anthropologists and as researchers. To what extent do we need to actively engage with issues of human rights? So what the statement says is that indeed, again, according to the AAA, right, and as an expectation of professional anthropologists, that it is important that we are not only aware of human rights, but that we are actively pursuing that human rights are upheld and that human rights abuses are called out in our field sites and anywhere else that we encounter them. That statement on anthropology and human rights starts by asserting that human rights are inherent, right? People simply have human rights. In other words, the laws around human rights are something that is meant to to uphold those rights. It doesn't create those rights, right? So we don't need to talk about human rights for them to exist. Now, on the kind of flip side of that, the statement also alludes to the issue of cultural relativism, right, which I talked about on the last slide. So if we have this sort of commitment to universal human rights, the AAA statement also notes that the way that human rights has been formulated has often been quite ethnocentric. It assumes a universality of how people understand what a human is and what human rights are. So, for example, human rights policies and initiatives often start from the premise that human rights are individual rights. And as the statement points out, that is not how even persons are understood in all cultural contexts, right? The idea of whether the individual person is the most important unit or whether the society or the cultural group or the family are the most important sort of ways that people identify themselves. Those are culturally variable things. So what this statement is trying to do is to embrace both things, that we can be cultural relativists and still say there are universal human rights, and as anthropologists we need to work on making sure that they are upheld. So what does that mean, actually, for how cultural anthropologists should or do address human rights? The idea here is that anthropologists need to go beyond that basic do no harm component of the code of ethics. It needs to be more active than that, right? The statement on anthropology and human rights says that anthropologists should be, in fact, actively defending human rights and calling out human rights abuses. That commitment is now a central part, or should be a central part, of simply how we do our work, right? So the statement suggests, for example, that forms of research that contribute to decolonization and help redress histories of oppression and exploitation need to be central to our research agendas, and that we have a responsibility to develop, through research, scholarship, and practice, a robust global framework of justice. So you can see then how the AAA statement on anthropology and human rights is building on that code of ethics, right? As individuals in the field, we need to uphold ethical standards in how we interact with the people in our field site. But then at a broader level, as anthropologists, we need to frame our research projects and our broader sort of goals as professionals around this important issue of maintaining and upholding human rights and calling out human rights abuses when we see them or encounter them through our work. Okay, so in addition to that AAA statement, you also read a couple of articles that are sort of more specific examples of anthropologists grappling with issues of human rights and human rights abuses. So the first is the one written by Paul Farmer, who I have pictured here on the right. He sadly died a few years ago. He was a very important figure in this question, particularly of health and human rights. Farmer was trained both as a cultural anthropologist and as a physician, so he was a PhD MD. And he also was a very sort of active practitioner in the field and a public health advocate. He founded an organization called Partners in Health that he refers to in the article that you read, which worked in places where public health was a significant challenge. For example, a lot of the work of Partners in Health took place in Haiti, and really working at a grassroots level to provide health services as well as to work on the broader sort of structural causes of poor health, particularly in poorer parts of the world. So what does Farmer say in this article? Well, he starts simply by saying that health and human rights as a subject of work and activism really still has a long way to go, right? There's a lot of things still to be realized. Why is that? Well, some of the problems are that, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about on the previous slide, that human rights are, initiatives and policies and policy statements around human rights often are not really framed in a way that is particularly useful. For example, he notes that a lot of approaches to human rights end up being ineffective because they are appealing to the perpetrators of human rights abuses. In other words, human rights initiatives and policies, pacts, etc., often are directed towards states, right, towards national governments. And it is those national governments, it is states that are the perpetrators of human rights abuses. So starting there, is certainly a more challenging approach, and as he points out, often a more ineffective approach. Part of that also is that human rights work has often been abstract. A lot of, if you read even the International Declaration on Human Rights or any of the other sort of major human rights policy declarations, they're sort of big, broad assertions, right, about what should happen or what basic human rights are. But they're based on principles, not on actual activity. And that is one of the key things that Farmer is calling out here, is that if we really want human rights to be enacted in the way that we aspire for them to be, stuff needs to be happening in an active way on the ground. It can't just be sort of big, lofty ideas that are written about. It needs to be people doing stuff in the real world. Farmer, as a physician and somebody who's obviously been involved in public health, is also suggesting that health is an important component of how we think about human rights, right? human rights broadly includes all kinds of things, not just health, right? But things like, access to decent housing, access to education, right? But he suggests that health is an important angle and that it is a way to really increase the viability of human rights being enacted more broadly. When he talks about health, though, he's making an important distinction, right? He's not talking about health as an individual issue. He's talking about health in broad social and economic context, right? So back to the idea of how the AAA talks about human rights, that sort of ethnocentric idea that tends to get folded into the way human rights are talked about as if it's just each person needs to have their rights defended, right? That model is not the model that Farmer is working on here. He's talking about health at a sort of level of societies and populations, and understanding especially the power dynamics that make health poorer in some regions of the world and better in other regions of the world. That those dynamics, those kind of global political economic dynamics, we need to understand those and we need to address those if we really want to understand health as a human right. Some fields, like anthropology, for example, are really helpful in understanding that global social and economic approach to health and well-being. In fact, in the article, Farmer refers to fields like anthropology as the, quote, contextualizing disciplines, which I think is a good way of capturing why social sciences like anthropology are really helpful here. So it's, again, taking the health of an individual, say, and putting it into context, right? What is the social, political, economic context of that individual that led to their ill health? So in other words, this is about thinking about health not as something that we start from thinking as being about the individual biological body of that person, right? That in fact, what happens in the individual biological body of that person is the end of the story, not the beginning of the story. A whole bunch of other social and economic things happened to that person, or that person was born into a context that informed how that individual biological body would experience its life, right? So that is the approach that he's advocating for and saying is a really important vantage on thinking about human rights more broadly and especially in regards to health. Now, that's all still a little bit abstract. So he gives a very specific example that I want to allude to now, and it's the example of Russian prisons, and particularly the problem of tuberculosis in Russian prisons. He's giving this example as to help us think about how it is that an individual Russian prisoner dying of, or at least being infected with drug-resistant TB is not about that individual person's health as much as it is about broader social and economic forces. So let's look a little bit at this specific example of Farmer's example of TB in Russian prisons, again, as an example of thinking about health in social and economic context. So what he's really arguing for here is that drug-resistant tuberculosis is the end of the story. It's not the starting place. If you want to address drug-resistant tuberculosis in Russian prisons, you don't start there. You start with the much bigger context that led to that problem. And so he teases out sort of the sequence of things that have happened that have led to that problem of drug-resistant TB in prisons. So starting in a much sort of, again, starting in a realm that is not about health per se, but that poverty and increased crime in Russia has led to a greater number of people, particularly poorer people, being detained, right, for those crimes. And again, for reasons having to do with the socioeconomic system in Russia and the political system, those detentions often are lengthy, right, longer than would be warranted by some of those petty crimes. And the places where people are detained have very poor conditions. There's a lack of food. There's not a lot of hygiene. These are small, close spaces. So there are lots of people crammed together in these settings. And TB, right? TB infection exists in those spaces where all these people get crammed in for these long detentions based on these petty crimes that they commit. People are exposed to TB, they contract TB, and then on top of that, they also don't get adequate treatment, right? In the prison system, of course, there's health services, but as Farmer points out, there's a lack of resources. Some of the doctors are sort of even resistant, understanding that it's sort of something they can't control. There's an idea that cost effectiveness is important. So in other words, you can't use the most expensive, most effective drug to treat it. You need to use the cheaper drugs, right? And what that all those conditions lead to is tuberculosis in these prisons that is resistant to the first line or baseline drugs, right? So even the drugs that are being administered are not working, right? And they're contributing to this problem that you have TB infections that are much harder to treat. And then, again, because in part of things like that idea of cost effectiveness, there's a lack of that treatment. Those treatments exist, but they're not being provided. And they're often classified as untreatable. One of the things Farmer's doing in talking about that is calling that out. He and his team from Partners in Health went to these Russian prisons as doctors, right? Not, as he says, not really as advocates or as activists per se, but as doctors, right? With the ability to treat those cases, right? Those cases are in fact treatable. It's only in this setting where they're being kind of classified as untreatable that you have this growing problem. So then, what that leads to is greater mortality, right? So in some cases you have people dying, but the other problem, right, which he talks about a little bit less in this case, this work that he's done on Russian prisons, he's published in other places, but the other problem is that then you have some of these folks, some of these incarcerated individuals who are infected with drug-resistant TB, who do ultimately get released, still infected with drug-resistant tuberculosis. So then you also have them potentially infecting family members when they go home and the wider society, right? So the point here is that there's a whole sequence of things, and there's a whole bunch of different social and economic forces that are contributing to the growth of an epidemic of drug-resistant TB. So at the end of the day, you could say that the epidemic of incarceration ultimately leads to an epidemic of drug-resistant TB. We don't think of incarceration as a health issue per se, but if we take a step back, kind of zoom out in our analysis, right? In fact, that is what's going on. If we want to deal with epidemic disease, in some cases what we need to look at is a non-health issue, right? Or what appears to be a non-health issue. That's that contextualizing analysis that Farmer refers to. So what should be done? Farmer's article, I think, is not all just, doom and gloom about the state of health and human rights. But he does say, again, work is to be done. There's lots of work to be done. And there are some specific things that he argues for. So the broadest thing he argues for is making health the center of human rights work, both because it can include pragmatic services, right? So it can include actually providing medical services for people, giving people the medications they need, etc. And it can also take that sort of social structural analytical approach to individual health outcomes that understands that they are not, health does not begin and end at the level of the individual, right? So more practically speaking, what that means is that he's suggesting that research has to be accompanied by practical interventions. This is very similar to what the AAA statement said, right? As researchers with an ethical obligation to understand and address human rights, then our research agendas, the way we ask questions, the work we do, needs to be informed by that commitment to intervening in those situations. He also argues that it may suggest the need for changes to education, how we talk to people about health and epidemics in the world, right? Understanding them to not be solely or even primarily biological phenomena. And finally, the importance for human rights work to be independent from governments, right? As we talked about a little bit earlier, one of the problems with a lot of human rights initiatives is that they go to the perpetrators, right? They make suggestions to or try to convince governments to act on these human rights pledges. But states are the perpetrators of human rights abuses. So instead, the work for health and human rights needs to be done independent from those political entities. Okay. The final piece that you read is an interesting piece. It's an essay. It's also a photo essay. So it includes portraits of some of the people involved in this community initiative that we'll talk about in a moment, as well as providing some narrative discussion of this work and the context for what's happening in Nairobi, Kenya. So the women and some men as well who are depicted in the photo essay are members of a group called Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network in Nairobi, Kenya, and they're people who are the relatives of individuals who were killed in police violence, and trying to address this particular human rights problem. One of the reasons I had you read it, this particular piece, is that I think it has something in common with what Paul Farmer was talking about. I think it underlines a key concept that Farmer also alludes to, and that is the concept of structural violence. Structural violence is the idea that social and economic inequities determine who is at risk for poor health, for violence, for just challenges to well-being more generally. The idea with structural violence is that inequities are structured into one's daily life, and those structured inequities determine your health, your life expectancy, your wellness, the likelihood that you will, for example, be killed through police violence. All of those things, again, which are challenges to health, really, but to well-being more generally. All of those things are about broad social and economic inequities, right? These are global inequities. So it's a concept that helps us get out of the idea of thinking about, for example, a person being shot by police in Nairobi as being an individual incident or one person's experience or demise. Instead, stepping back and understanding that individual, the moment of that individual person being killed by police, is the end of a long story. Lots of other things took place and continue to take place that created the conditions for that shooting to happen. Okay. So Kamari, who wrote this piece, talks about what are some of the earlier steps in that process or earlier chapters of that story that lead to that moment of police violence. And it goes back to the colonial era in Kenya, right? So it goes back a long way, hundreds of years. And the way that, in fact, Nairobi as a city was set up, right, and segregated through colonial urban planning. So it's a city, as you learned through this essay, where people are segregated into particular parts of the city, particular neighborhoods. And the neighborhood that she's talking about is a poor neighborhood that is also a place that experiences lots of violence. So the way that people are sort of contained in a particular geographical part of the city is about impoverishment, right? It's about economic inequity. It's also about just a sort of systematic lack of access to all kinds of resources. So Kamari talks, for example, about systematic dehydration. People in that community don't have access to running water. So there's this perennial problem of getting water to the community. And indeed, one of the examples that is discussed in the essay is about a young man who is doing the work of collecting water and bringing it back to the community. And in doing so, he breaks a curfew, and that's what ends up to him being shot by police, right? So what, again, the argument here is that that basic set of ways that life is organized, the segregation, the distribution of resources, the inequitable distribution of resources, including really, I think, what we can all consider like the most fundamental kind of resource, water, right? Water, food, housing. These are all the things that are the premise of what it means to have human rights. So in a system where people are systematically denied access to those basic resources, those basic human rights, then you can see the sort of desperation that takes place in people's lives. And then in this setting, police are being used to maintain that inequitable system. So on top of lack of access to resources, segregation in a particular part of the city, there's police brutality, right? And extrajudicial killings, meaning something that's sort of just taken on by police without any proper procedure or any recourse on the part of the people who experience that violence. So it's a brutal situation that's being described in this article. One of the other reasons, though, that I assigned it is because it is also about grassroots activism in response to that kind of structural violence. The group that's being highlighted in this photo essay, that Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network, is a grassroots activist organization that has responded to that problem of police violence and really trying to, as the article says, denaturalize it, right? So to call out that this cannot be the norm. We cannot take for granted that state violence is just part of everyday life. And they're doing that through a number of ways, pushing back in a number of ways. And one is simply using art as a sort of community activism, right? So things like photo exhibits and other kinds of art exhibits as ways to make public what is happening and to, again, call out the ways that human rights abuses have been systematically embedded in everyday life in society and come to be naturalized or taken for granted in such a way that they continue, right? That there's no break in that system and in that process. So this group, this mothers group, is saying no to that and coming up with, again, small-scale grassroots ways to reject that model of everyday structural violence and to try to turn the corner on how their everyday lives look. Okay, we're going to stop there. I hope you're enjoying the unit on human rights, and we'll talk again soon.